Welcome to Books in the World. I'm Madeline Mealy Holt, and I'm here today with Lily Poritz Miller. Hello, Lily. Nice to have you. Lily is the author of two very interesting books about a family that started in Lithuania, emigrated to South Africa, and then emigrated to Massachusetts, and in not very happy circumstances, pre-World War II, Jewish family, right. Displaced a couple of times. I'd like to invite everyone to think about reading The Newcomer, which is the book I read, but In the Pale Blue Light is the book that was written before. And Lily's going to tell us more about how she came to write these books. But before she does, I'd like to just read a little quote from one of the reviewers, just to give you an idea of the warmth and the spirit that comes across in these books, which are very, very well done and quite an interesting read. So this is from Quill and Quire, and it says, Miller builds a lively, gently humorous portrait of a loving but fractious family grappling with a new world. With their engaging quirks and distinctly wrought personalities, these characters convince an old-fashioned tale of family and the challenges of immigrant life. Isn't that wonderful for an author when someone says these characters convince?
Yes.
It makes you feel good, I'm sure.
Yes, and I think character is the most important thing in my writing. And I started my life as a playwright, and that I could always hear voices, I could see people in action, and for me the most important thing in creating a work is if the characters spring to life. And I'm lucky that it's almost a magical process for me.
Yes.
Like, yeah, I don't even have much control. Like often when I sit down, I'm not really sure yet what will happen. And the characters, they lead me. They become alive. And the first thing I wrote was a play which was written in a single weekend. It was a college assignment. And I thought, how am I going to do it? It was a 3-day weekend. And the characters, they just sprang to life and they led me on. So it's always rewarding to know that the people in my stories are real.
They are real. Well, yeah. These books, The Newcomer and In a Pale Blue Light, are really the stories of your family life. Can you tell us how you came to, you had an interesting career, and we're going to get back to that, but right. Have focused more on writing these books recently after doing some research into your family life.
Right, right.
Well,
I think from the beginning it was, I think deep within me, I always wanted to be a writer. And I remember this because after my father died, when I was 15, my mother and my siblings, there were 5 children, we went on this long ocean voyage to America. And that's when I began to write, and I did a diary. So it was deep within me, but my mother was a widow, 5 small children to raise and educate, and it just did not seem practical that I could, you know, enter into that. When I was 21, I went off to New York. I had the dream of being a playwright and an actor, then called an actress, and I needed a job, so I was lucky enough to get an entry-level job at a company, Macmillan, and then with the years, I started off reading unsolicited manuscripts, and with the years, I became an editor, and it was so rewarding and so fulfilling to work with authors that my own passion was put on the back burner.
Yes. Okay.
And I kept, whenever I could take a little time off, I would go to my mother's house in this little town that in my new book I call Little Falls.
Yes.
And I would write notes, but it didn't really go very far. And years later, after a long publishing career and changes in the world of publishing that I did not feel comfortable with, I was no longer close, I somehow went back to my first passion, which was writing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you, I would like to get back to talking about some of the authors that you worked with after we talk about your book, because I don't want to, I'm actually torn. I love talking about your book, and I love talking about the writers that you worked with, so we're going to try to do both. First of all, as I mentioned to you, many people don't understand that Jewish people were able to leave Hitler's control early, before the war really got too advanced, and went to South Africa. And there was a South African community there, and that's what happened with your family. And then your main character, your Libka, who is you in a sense, went through quite a bit of turmoil there. And then, as you said, you went to America later on, and then she had to adjust there. So I guess what I'd like to hear a little bit more about is the process of being a newcomer in two different situations.
Right.
And also, if you could say a little bit of something about the difference between writing a memoir and writing a fictionalized account of something like that.
Right. Well, in many ways, even though this book is The Newcomers, my parents were newcomers. I mean, they left Lithuania around 1930, and they were the fortunate ones. And at that time, many people from Lithuania had, well, they were leaving if they were lucky enough. There were those, now the Jewish community, many dreamt of Palestine, building a homeland for the Jews. There were people, of course, who always dreamt of America, the Golden Land. And one of the main characters in my new book is one such. He was the brother of my mother, and he did make his way to America. But my father was a dreamer and a romantic, and the lure of South Africa just overcame him. My mother would have preferred Palestine. She was more inclined to Zionism. Mm-hmm. But so they journeyed on the long ocean voyage to South Africa, and that's where the children were born, my siblings and I.
Was there a Jewish community there?
Yes, there was, of many, many Jews from Lithuania, who had come there, you know, really in a very modest way, and in a short time in that country it was possible to establish themselves. Mm. So my childhood was in Cape Town, South Africa. And it was a very, very troubled world. Even as a child, I knew there was something very wrong about the way the blacks and the coloreds were treated, and the aloofness and the coldness of those who employed them. Mm-hmm. And really my greatest need for writing emerged after my father's death, when my world seemed to fall apart. I was very close to him, and so were my siblings. Mm. And that isolated me from many things. So my first book, In a Pale Blue Light, dealt with my childhood in South Africa.
So then, after your father died, your mother decided to go to America at the invitation of her brother.
Yes.
And that is really the story of the Newcomers. And yes. Your uncle went through a rough time of his own before he got to America, and went through Cuba. And when he got there, I'm going to let you speak about it, but I was very affected by his story, and the fact that he and your mother were very close, and then by the time he went through all the turmoil that he went through, he had become quite a different person, and not a very nice person, I would have to say, at least the way you depict it. You could say a little bit more what you think happened to him.
Well, my father's death coincided with news that we had lost most of our relatives in Europe in the Holocaust. And it was a deeply painful thing. We felt extremely alone. And my mother, you know, I would just remember that late at night she would sing tragic Yiddish songs in the kitchen. It was a way of dealing with the terrible grief and the loss. So it seemed that our life there was just at a dead end. And my uncle, who had made his way to America after great difficulty, 5 years in Cuba, where he languished, and finally he made his way to America. And at the time when we heard the tragic news that our family had perished in Europe and my father died, a letter came from my uncle, who lived in a little town in Massachusetts, which I call Little Falls. And he said, now that we know we have lost our family and you have lost your dear Joseph, it is more important than ever for us to join together to give each other strength. So gather your children and come to America. My mother had had a wonderful relationship with her brother in their youth in the small Lithuanian town. They were both, even living in the small town, which there is referred to as the shtetl in Eastern Europe, they had read their way through all the great Russian classics, and they shared this deep passion, and they could even quote Shakespeare. And when my uncle was in Cuba for 5 years, enormous reams of correspondence traveled between my mother and him, and they gave each other strength. And the closeness was just a very deep one. By the time my mother gathered us and came to America, over 20 years had passed since my uncle and my mother were together. And the person that she encountered really bore no resemblance to the brother she had loved and known.
Well, he treated your family as a charity case. He aggrandized himself in the eyes of his friends by being so magnificent to you. And I have to say that as sad as some of it is, there is some humor.
Yes, I hope so.
There is a light touch.
Yes.
You don't make a villain out of him, really. But you see that at this point, your story is told through the eyes of your character, who was about 16 at the time.
Right.
Yeah. And she comes from probably an upper class world in South Africa. Her father was an industrial company owner.
Right.
So she is very unhappy about wearing hand-me-down clothes, not living in a very nice house. So it was a very tough time, very tough time. But she soldiers on, and she has to put up with some real indignities and some hurts. And we were talking earlier, you and I, about how different kids adjust a little better than other kids. Sometimes it might be a little bit an age thing, a personality.
Right.
But one of the things that I found amusing was her relationship with this man that her uncle wanted her to date him, or the aunt, one of the...
Oh, the aunt, the mother, everyone wanted to date him. Yeah.
Everyone, he would have been a good catch, I guess.
A wonderful
A
catch.
wonderful catch. But Lipka was very young, and she tried to be a good girl.
Yes.
That
But she couldn't succeed at that.
But she went pretty far, I thought,
Yeah.
toward allowing weeks or months of these dates, right to the point where he proposed to her.
Yes.
And so, do you think that's because she was feeling so ill at ease in the new environment? She was trying to make people like her? Or why do you think she let that go on so long?
Well, she let it go on. It was very simple. This was the great ambivalence within her. On the one hand, even though she fought with her mother, and her mother's dream was that, you know, Lipka would find a good husband. That was the dream of every mother at that time,
right.
especially in a small Jewish community.
Yeah.
And here was a man who was extremely eligible, who was established. He was a little older. The American girls went after him. And for some mysterious reason, he started dating Lipka. And I guess she often felt that he was sorry for her. But she was very timid and awkward. And he used to take her to all these restaurants and to the dance halls, and she had never danced before. She'd trip over his feet, and everything was wonderful. And she had to drink all these cocktails, grasshopper, and who knows. And all she had had is a sip of, you know, her Yiddish wine, Manischewitz kosher wine. But he continued to pursue her, and every Monday he would call to reserve Saturday night. And her mother, the poor widow, whose dream was that, you know, her children would establish them, she was so happy. She had to watch her funds because she wanted us all to have good educations and so on. But when it came to Lipka's outfits for the Saturday night dates, there was absolutely no limit. Just for such things, I can still afford to draw out.
You did a good job with that for such things. And
the more that happened, the more Lipka despised him.
Oh, and the dresses that she dressed her up like a wedding cake.
The crinolines, yes, they all looked like wedding dresses. Yeah.
Well, eventually Lipka does stand on her own 2 feet.
She breaks away, let's say.
She breaks away.
Yeah.
There's some interesting problems that she faces, which I won't reveal. Some of them are quite tough. A little bit of abuse goes on there. It reminded me of adolescence in general. It's a secretive time.
Right.
Anything that's a little shameful, of course, you never tell anybody. You know.
Right.
You do things that you try things, or people are, you know, not so nice to you. There were some very interesting things. Also, the picture of the mother running the laundromat. That was a very tough. Turn of affairs, I'd have to say, for her.
Many readers have written and they said, well, mothers are no longer like that. And it's true that she sacrificed everything. Some years after my father's death, there was a man in South Africa who offered her the world. She could have lived like a queen in South Africa. And then when the letter came from my uncle saying, now that you are all alone, you know, come to America. She had to decide between the life that this wonderful man could offer and her children and family. And I think she often regretted her choice when we came to America. But her great devotion was for her children. And she was a woman who was not used to menial work and domestic work. She was the only daughter. But she really persevered. She did everything to provide for her children, and that was her life. And she gave up you know, the
gave up,
possibility of a different
She never
kind of life.
considered going back or having him come to America?
They would dream of it through letters.
Yes.
Through the letters that are really so heart-wrenching. He continued to love her, but he was always afraid that he didn't want to sway her from her commitment to the children.
Yeah.
So it was only after she had left and they were apart that he finally could say, "I love you." And
the children were, your older brother was about 18?
yes.
And the youngest one was 2 years old, 3 years old?
Yes, yes,
So-
when my father died.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there were 5. She had a lot of responsibility, and the children were
Right.
quite young. I mean, the 3 of you or 2 of you could have gone on your own after a few years, but not the youngest 2 were
No,
babies.
she carried an enormous burden, and she never complained. She never complained.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how long did she run the laundromat?
For quite some years.
Yeah.
And then later on, I guess after we grew up and we made our own lives and all that, she returned to just, my mother's eyes since girlhood were extremely poor. But she devoured everything. And she spent a great deal of time reading. And at one time, she knew many languages, because in Europe, as regimes changed, she had to learn one of the languages being Russian. So for a while, she was doing translation work for the government.
My goodness.
Yeah. And her later years with her grandchildren around and so on were peaceful.
Now, Lipka has a tough time in school. I think some people thought she was African because that's all they knew was Africa and African. They didn't know who this white person was, what her background was. Eventually, she becomes friendly with children, a friend who's Portuguese American.
Right,
yeah,
right.
She went to a gypsy a couple of times. Yeah. So she found her own way.
She always seemed to gravitate to people who were different, who didn't fit perfectly, because she herself didn't fit perfectly.
Well, she was a brave and sensitive and kind, and she was very good to her mother also.
She loved her mother, but my mother had really tough times with her.
I wanted to talk about your career as an editor, since this is a program of the Cape Cod Writers Center, and so many writers are, hopefully listening, but are following the work of the other members of the Cape Cod Writers Conference. And we only have about 5 minutes to talk about this. So you worked with some very big names in Canada. Could you tell us about some of them and how you worked with them? And I guess the point of the question is, what is it like to be an editor, and what can a writer expect in a good relationship?
Yes,
things.
I was brought to Toronto by a publisher called McClellan & Stewart. I left New York at 1971, and I went to Montreal. New York had become too much for me at that time, and I hoped to continue my editorial career there, but I didn't know French sufficiently. And one day I was watching TV, and this charismatic figure loomed across with Pierre Trudeau. This was 70. And my sister, who was living in Montreal, said, "Why don't you contact Jack McClellan?" He was the key English publisher in Canada. So I did. This was before email, so I wrote a letter. And he came to see me, and he brought me to Toronto the following spring. And at that time, Canada was desperately in need of editors, and McClellan & Stewart had wonderful talent to develop. So I was lucky that because I had had my New York experience, I inherited, extraordinary writers. And what I discovered was that working with great writers is easier than working with those who are unsure of themselves. So that it was a rich and joyful time. Kept me away from my writing. This is why so many years later, here I am, starting.
Now you're starting. So give us some insight into some of these people. I mean, it was called kind of the golden age of Canadian publishing, and you were the, may I say it, the midwife of Canadian authors.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way, but really an editor was sort of a midwife then,
right,
because you worked behind the scenes, and the idea was not to overshadow the author, and I loved that. I loved that. It's a different world now. I mean, here I'm sitting doing publicity, right?
Right.
As an author.
Right.
In those days, an author could simply write and express themselves through their work.
Now I'm understanding is that writers have to find their own editors frequently. Is that,
yes.
Have you had that experience?
Well, it is so difficult nowadays to find a publisher, a traditional publisher. Even more difficult to find an agent who's willing to take. An agent will often pursue a person once they are established.
Yes.
So it's a very hard world, and probably this is why so many people are turning to self-publishing, and I think very good things can emerge from that.
I understand people are doing well enough with their self-publishing that they're encouraged.
Yes, and there was a time when there was stigma attached to it and that, but I think that is fading.
Yeah.
And of course, with self-publishing can come so many books that should never be published or read, but it is a good option for a writer.
It's nice to have the package. I think it's easier to show the package than to carry
but
a
it's
manuscript
a very hard
around.
world for a writer today.
Well, in your day, when you were editing Farley Moat or Sylvia Fraser or Michael Ondaatje, what kind of work did you do with them?
Well, I was not a copy editor. At that time in Canada, editing was thought of as copy editing, which was correcting spelling and this. I personally wasn't drawn to that. It was, what I always thought was to, the success the author had in creating the characters, the setting, it was a different kind. It was the basic story. Did it move? Were the people alive? Was the setting real?
Yeah.
And very often, the things that are closest to an author do not appear on paper because they're so real within.
Okay.
That's why very often the secondary character becomes more alive on paper than the real character. I know when I was writing my novel, I struggled most with the character that I felt closest to, because I thought it was alive. And that's where I was lucky enough to have a wonderful editor who said, well, she's not alive.
Oh, so she just, she
and
guided you. Well, you brought her to life. You did bring her to life.
Well, I was lucky enough to have a really good editor who knew when to leave me alone and knew when I needed direction.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. Can you believe it goes very quickly?
Yes.
Thank you so much. And
thank you.
Thank you for
Madeline.
opening up and sharing your thoughts about writing and your own experiences with writing these books. I want to encourage everyone to find The Newcomer by Lily Poritz Miller or In the Pale Blue Light, both of which are easily found on the internet at Amazon.com. Thank you, as always. I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, Lily.